In this introductory module for Excel, we're going to be covering a couple of the very basic functions within Excel. For those users that have had experience with using Excel in the past, a lot of the things that we're going to be covering today are really basic functionalities, but I wanted to make sure that we cover them for the class because as we move through some of the exercises, it's going to be key that everybody has an understanding of these particular features within Excel. So in this particular module, we're going to cover two features within Excel. The first one is the ability to lock particular cells when you're actually creating calculations, values. And then the second thing we're going to be covering is the use of the if function that we'll be using for some simple logic. So the first thing that we're going to cover is how you can create formulas within Excel and then lock those formulas to move those through other cells. So within Excel, you'll see that there is this function bar that is on the top, and what we have in this function bar is the ability to enter in an equal sign to begin to create a formula. In this particular case, if we wanted to multiply the value that is in cell B2 by the value that is in B5, we simply select on B2, enter a multiplication sign, and then we select on B5 and we hit enter. In this case, what that's doing is it's multiplying this cell by this cell and providing us a value. Pretty simple, pretty easy ability to reference values in Excel and create these formulas. Now, what if we wanted to multiply all the values that we had within the bottom matrix by the value of 1? In this case, what we can do is we can lock the value of B2. If we hit the F4 key that is in the top of your keyboard, you'll see that it enters two dollar signs, one in front of the B and one in front of the 2. What that represents in the formula is that that cell is locked. And if we were to take this formula and drag it across these different cells, you can see what's happened is Excel is intelligent enough to know that as you drag the formula, what's going to happen is when you move it across the columns, it's going to change from B5 to C5 and then to D5 as we move across there. And then by dragging it down, it's going to then go to B6, C6, and D6. But you can see that since we locked B2 in the very first formula, when we expanded this formula to fill in the rest of these cells, it had B2 locked in. So we had the ability in that case to be able to have B2 multiplied by all of these values, which in this case was just the value of 1, so it's basically the same matrix as the numbers you're multiplying by. Now, there is also the ability, if we clear out these formulas here, instead of locking B2, having a dollar sign in front of the B and a dollar sign in front of the 2, we have the ability, if we hit F4 on this value twice, you can see what it does is it will lock in the 2, but it doesn't put the dollar sign in front of the B. And what this means is then if we were to take this value, drag it across this side, it's pretty much moving across as we would expect. You'll see the B2, the C2, and the D2. It's moved across the top row. And basically we're multiplying 1 times 1, 10 times 2, 20 times 3. But now what happens is when we drag this to the bottom, it is still using these values that we've locked in the top of this formula for the multiplication. So in this case, we're multiplying the top row by this row, getting these values. And then by dragging it down, we're still, since we have locked on the 2 in the formula, you can see that we have the dollar sign in front of the 2, meaning that we've locked it on the second row. By dragging it down, it's not going to move to 3. It's going to stay on the second row. Now, one of the other things that we can do is if we want to, instead of locking it on 2, if we hit F4 one more time, we're able to put a dollar sign in front of the B, And what that will allow us to do is to lock in the column B, but allow the rows to float. Well, what this will do is basically allow us to multiply 1 times 1, 1 times 2, 1 times 3, but then also when we drag it down, it will be 2 times 2, 2 times 4, 2 times 6, because in this particular case we've locked on B. So in this case we drag it down, and then we drag it over, and you can see the multiplication still is 1 times 1, 1 times 2, 1 times 3, 2 times 2, 2 times 4, 2 times 6. So it's very important to understand when we're dragging these formulas, moving them across the screen to save us time and having to type them each and every time, that we understand what we're locking in place so we get the correct multiplication or the correct formula in each particular cell. I recommend if you have some time to generate some numbers in a worksheet and then try out these different locking techniques and dragging the formulas so that you can become familiar with how they lock the formulas. Alright, so the second thing that we wanted to cover in this module is how to use a function called if. And the if function is a very simple logical function, which again we go to the toolbar, the function bar. We hit the enter sign and we hit enter if, and then we put a left parentheses. And what we're able to do here is to enter a simple test. So if the value in C2 is greater than the value that is in B5, in this case it is, 10 is greater than 2, what we'll want to do is in this particular case say the value in the cell should be greater. Otherwise, the cell should be less than. So basically what we're doing here is we're saying if this particular case is true, what do we want to put into the cell? If this is false, what do we want to put into the cell? So you can see in this particular case, since 10 is greater than 2, it's greater. If we were to come up here, however, and put a 1 in, it changes it to show that it's less than. Now one thing that you'll find is if we enter in a 2 in this particular case, it still shows less than. The reason for that is we said if it is greater than C5, then show greater. Otherwise, in any particular case, not necessarily just in the case that it's less than, it could be less than or equal to, it's showing less than. So what we have the ability to do on these if statements is to nest them. And nesting if statement simply says that we're going to add a second if statement. So if C2 is greater than C5, we're going to say greater. Otherwise, if C2 equals C5, then we're going to say equal. Otherwise, less than. Now what's important about this is we still need to use the parentheses with our if statement. But you can see that since we're using 2, we want to make sure that we're closing all of our parentheses. So right now we have 2 left parentheses and only 1 right parentheses. So by adding a second one, we're able to close that statement, and you see now we've made it so that if we enter 3, it's greater than, 1, less than, 2, equal. So that's how we can create nested and more in-depth logic statements using the if command. So the two things we covered in this module is how to create a function, an equation using Excel, how to lock in particular aspects or particular variables within that equation, how to drag it across the screen, and then also how to use the if function, which is one of the many different functions we'll be using this semester in the class. I recommend that you try these different functions and locking in the variables, get familiar with that. We'll be using them in future modules.